Jamie Foxx and Elizabeth Banks, etc., very talented people in their own right, but we know who they are, we know about them, they get written about. The thing about the game show hosts of the past was it was this generation of people who pretty much just did game shows. They were the generation of professional game show hosts, and they didn't get their flowers a lot.
Welcome once again to the Talking Archive. I'm Josh Jacobs. By the way, check us out on Instagram at JoshDJ57. Also subscribe to our YouTube channel and get updates about when we have new podcasts. And the voice you just heard has been a friend of mine for 15 years. And he's the author of over a dozen game show books. He's written 5 biographies. And his newest book is called Gong This.
Gong This Book.
Gong This Book. I already got that wrong.
Pick it up.
We're going to keep that in here. Nedeff, thanks for being on the Talking Archive.
That's Gong, G-O-N-G, this, T-H-I-S, book, B-O-O-K. Gong This Book.
Well, tell us about your life growing up and how you got into game shows.
Yeah, I grew up in a little town called Vienna, West Virginia, just on the Ohio border, and was just always enamored with game shows. The way I've described it so many times is just the sensory appeal. When you're a little kid, you see a show that's just nothing but flashing lights and buzzers and things that spin and things that make noise and things that move around the stage. There's just a lot to be drawn to when you're a little kid, and you've got the host who's a different television personality than you see in a scripted drama or a scripted comedy show. The host is looking directly at you and talking directly to you, and I've learned a term for that, and I think the term is parasocial relationship. I think that's the term. But basically, it's you form a relationship with somebody who literally does not know that you exist. You begin to feel that that person is your friend because that's the way they talk to you on camera, and you, the audience, feel that way about them, even though there's nothing legitimate that you're basing that relationship on. So I always had a real fondness for the host, and so that was the first thing that I wanted to do when I grew up, when I was a kid, was I wanted to be a game show host. But as I got older, generally speaking, I kind of stretched that goal out, and it just became work in game shows because it just seemed like it would be fun no matter what I did.
Yeah, and tell me about who your favorite hosts were growing up initially, because by the time you were old enough, Gene Rayburn, Bill Cullen, they had pretty much stopped hosting game shows. Or do you remember them when you were a little kid?
I remember Bill Cullen because USA Network had their lineup of afternoon game shows. And I very, very strongly remember watching Bill on Chain Reaction and on Hot Potato because they reran those shows. So Bill I knew. Gene Rayburn I didn't know until I had Game Show Network as a teenager. But Bill Cullen was a favorite of mine. Pat Sajak and Bob Barker, who were the classic hosts of that period because they were the hosts of the 2 biggest shows. And then Mark Summers. I'm a child of the late 80s and the early 90s, which means I grew up with Double Dare. Mark Summers is my Bill Cullen. He's my generation's Bill Cullen. So those were my favorites growing up. Those are the guys that I always wanted to emulate if I ever got a chance to do this work.
That's great. And you've gotten to meet Mark Summers before.
Excuse me.
That's all right.
I got so choked up thinking about the opportunity to work with Mark Summers. No, do you have a cough drop or anything like that? One of those buttons? No, not literal cough drop, but do you have one of those buttons like you have in this?
Unfortunately, I don't.
your guests are just left to suffer here.
Yeah, we could always edit that out of post-production.
No worries.
Let me just mark that in.
No. I got a chance to work with Mark Summers because Nickelodeon rebooted Double Dare a few years ago, and I got to live the childhood dream of childhood dreams. Was as a grown-up, I got to work on my childhood favorite show. And Mark Summers was involved not just as the announcer, but he was an executive producer behind the scenes. And if ever there's an image that just jumps out at you and makes you say, do not screw this up, it's when you come to work on your first day and your desk is directly facing an office door with Mark Summers, executive producer, posted on the door. That was a nerve-wracking first thing to see, but he's a terrific guy. He's very, very nice to the people that work for him and with him. So it was a real pleasant experience working on that show, and really one of my favorite shows that I've had the chance to work on. It's one of my deathbed shows. It's the experience that I'm hoping replays over and over again when I'm on my way out.
Now, the original one was made in Philadelphia, then Universal Studios Orlando.
Yeah.
Where was this new one made?
This one was at the Radford Studios, the CBS Radford Studios, which used to be the MTM Studios from Mary Tyler Moore. And then prior to that, it was a film studio. And the fun thing about that is there's a little bit of acknowledgement all throughout the complex of what shows were there. Not just in a general sense, but the specific locations. As you go throughout the complex, you know what happened on that specific site. And I'm very excited to tell you that my office was located on Gilligan's Island. That was a dream within a dream, to report to work at what was called the Lagoon Building, and just know that this is where 7 stranded castaways tried to make the best of a bad situation together. So that was a lot of fun working on that show, and just as a TV history junkie, looking around the studio complex and seeing, oh, this is where they filmed The Twilight Zone, this is where they filmed Alfred Hitchcock Presents, this is where they filmed Hill Street Blues. And it's just everything that you hope that working in the TV or film business would be when you're a kid trying to imagine what it's like, and it's exactly like that. There's the little section of the studio complex that they call Little New York, which is, it's supposed to look like a gritty urban area with little shop fronts and apartment complexes, and it's all just camouflage for the entrances to the studio doors, but it looks like New York City, and the entrance to the studio is designed to look like a subway tunnel. So and that's the West Virginia Rube in me coming out. I'm living in Los Angeles, so yes, I've seen a subway entrance. But it's still just really neat to see how the magic happens and to be kind of inside that, especially when you were a kid so far removed from show business and wondering what it was like and seeing it with a little bit of mystique and seeing it with a little bit of romance.
Oh, yeah. And I thought Mark Summers was great as announcer. The hostess they had, I forget what her name was.
Liza Koshy. Liza Koshy was a doll. She was there. She was just so enthusiastic. She was so dialed in, wanted to do the best job possible, and just we all adored her. So everything, it's almost Pollyanna-ish, especially there have been so many stories and documentaries in the last few years about the downside of show business, and yes, that exists. But I've been very fortunate in dodging those bullets. My experiences working in the TV business have been extremely positive. I've worked with people that I love. I've worked with people that I'd want to be around even if I wasn't working with them. And just the chance to make a game show, there's nothing sinister, there's no seamy underbelly about it. It's exactly what it looks like on television. It really is just a fun job.
What are the chances of them coming back with Mark and Liza for Double Dare? Because, I mean, I think it should have gotten a much longer run than it did. Is there any talk around town about maybe bringing it back?
To my knowledge, there's not, but Double Dare is a perennial thing at this point, I think. They've certainly had a track record of it when it wasn't in production. Double Dare they had enormous success with as a live production in various scaling formats. Sometimes they would do the show in arenas, and sometimes they would even do it in hotels. They've got a version of Double Dare that scales down small enough that they can do it in a hotel ballroom, basically.
Wow.
And they did that for a little while with Nickelodeon when the show wasn't in production. So there's a lot of stuff that you can still do with Double Dare. There's a lot of stuff. There's always going to be life in formats, especially because it has a track record and because television doesn't always reward creativity and television doesn't always reward innovation and new ideas. It's a lot easier to go back to the well of here's what we've done that's already worked. What can we do that's already worked that we know will be a hit because the track record says it'll be a hit? So because of that, Double Dare is just now and forever going to be a good choice for a show that could go back into production anytime. And there are a lot of successful shows like that. But basically, yeah, if there's a show that was a hit at some point, it's on that to-do list forever of things that we might go back to someday.
Yeah, definitely. And now, how did you get to writing your first book? Because you've written a dozen books over the last dozen years. Mm-hmm. Describe the process of writing that first book.
So I always had the idea that I wanted to write books. There were a lot of books about game shows on the market. But the books about game shows tended to fall into two camps. One was how to be a contestant, and certainly that's of interest, and certainly the people who have written those books have plenty of experience in their own right, being contestants on game shows and have a lot of wisdom to share. So it's completely understandable that a lot of those books would be out there. The other one was like the Encyclopedia of TV game shows, where it would go into what the games were, what the formats were, who the host was. And again, a wonderful type of book. But what I wasn't seeing a lot of on the market was stories. I wanted stories about game shows. The Archive of American Television does a wonderful series of oral history interviews. And I was listening to an interview with Bob Stewart one day, and Bob Stewart told a story about something that went wrong with the Winner's Circle during an early taping of $10,000 Pyramid. And I just remember thinking, wow, that's the kind of thing that I want in a book. It was such a good story, and it was such a neat account of here's what happens, here's what went wrong while we were taping a game show, here's how we fixed it, and here's how we presented it on the air, and here were all the decisions we made leading up to that. And that was the kind of stuff that I wanted to preserve. So I wanted to write books about the history of game shows, but a behind-the-scenes account, not just here's the show and how it worked. What really got me to do it full speed was I got 15 Minutes of Fame. I was on Conan on TBS very shortly after he had made his jump from NBC to TBS, and he was doing a bit where he was visiting Madame Tussauds Hollywood, the famous wax attraction, where I was working, and he was taking a tour of it to see his wax figure. And I was the lucky duck chosen to be his tour guide, which was a story in and of itself because I wasn't supposed to be his tour guide and didn't know until the night before that shot that I was going to be on Conan. Somebody else was supposed to do it, and she got cold feet, and a member of management spoke up and said, well, if she's not going to do it, Adam Nedeff should do it. And so that ended up working out. And I got 15 Minutes of Fame out of that segment. And not just 15 Minutes of Fame initially, but then they reran it several times. So I kept getting, it kept extending the 15 Minutes of Fame. And there was a stretch of about 6 months where people were getting their photos taken with me at Madame Tussauds.
Wow.
So that was a little wild. But what happened during the course of the segment was they film a lot more for these remote pieces than they actually show on the air. And Conan had a conversation with me about being a game show fan. And we chatted for about 20 minutes, and I could tell he was trying to mine me for humor, which I'm all for. I didn't mind that. But it wasn't really clicking the way I think he wanted it to click. So after 20 minutes, we moved on and talked about something else. But he had a full-blown conversation with me about being a game show fan. So along the way during this conversation, I mentioned I wanted to write a book about the history of game shows. And I went home and I thought about it and I said, okay, so I said it out loud. I said it where people could hear it. I said it with a camera running, and there's a chance it'll air on television. I have told the world that I wanted to write a book about game shows. And I want to write a book is a thing that everybody says.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very hollow ambition. There's not that there's anything shameful in writing a book. The hollow ambition is people say it so much because it makes you sound smart, but they don't really mean it. So I'm like, okay, I really have to write a book now. So I gave myself a year. I called in, and I didn't have that many contacts in the game show business at that point, but I called in every contact I had, which I could count on one hand, and I was able to put together a decent book called This Day in Game Show History, which turned into a 2,000-page mammoth by the time I was done with the manuscript. So they divided it up into 4 books when it went on sale, which was good for me because that was not just instant credibility, but a lot of credibility because now it was kind of like I had cheated because by the time my first book came out, I could say I had written 4 books. I actually wrote 1 book, but they released it as 4, so I can say, yeah, yes, I've written 4 books. What have you been doing with your life while I was writing 4 books? So those books came out, and then I started moving into writing biographies of the game show hosts. Game show hosts, very uncelebrated, underappreciated class of talent, and you have to explain that to this new generation, not to sound like an old man, but the current crop of game show hosts are people who were already established in other fields and move into hosting game shows. So Jamie Foxx and Elizabeth Banks, etc., very talented people in their own right, but we know who they are. We know about them. They get written about. The thing about the game shows, the game show hosts of the past was it was this generation of people who pretty much just did game shows. They were the generation of professional game show hosts, and they didn't get their flowers a lot. They did get press and they did get stuff, and certainly I needed all the help I could get researching this thing, so I'm grateful for the press they got. But nobody in the 1960s was clamoring to write a biography of Bill Cullen or Gene Rayburn, even though they were popular TV stars, particularly in the case of Bill Cullen, who was the star of the number 8 show on television in terms of the TV ratings. He about 35 million people a week for The Price is Right. So these guys needed to get their due. So I began writing these books, these biographies of Bill Cullen, Gene Rayburn, Dennis James, Alan Ludden, Monty Hall. And that was my way of, giving recognition to this group of broadcasters who didn't get the celebration that they deserved in their time.
Yeah, in fact, I remember with Bill Cullen, you got to talk with his widow, Ann, who has sadly since passed away. And you interviewed Bob Stewart, Sandy Stewart. Well, you interviewed Sandy Stewart. Did you interview Bob Stewart?
No, in fact, that was the one. So Conan was the motivation to write This Day in Game Show History and write those first 4 books. I was kicking around writing game show biographies, and I wasn't sure about it. And then Bob Stewart died. And Bob Stewart would have been the guy to talk to about Bill Cullen because he was Bill's biggest backer as a TV producer. Hired him to host The Price is Right, hired him to host I Guess, hired him to host the nighttime $25,000 Pyramid and Chain Reaction. And they were best buddies away from the television studio. So Bob Stewart would have been the guy. And about a month after Bob Stewart died, that was when I decided, you know what, we lost the most important interviewer for the most important interviewee for this book. If a book about Bill Cullen is going to be written, it has to be written now. So that was the motivation for writing about Bill.
And how did you get in contact with Ann Cullen?
Fred Westbrook was a wonderful man, and unfortunately so many of these people who helped me along the way have now left us, which there's kind of a message there about, appreciating people when they're around, because it has only been 10 or 11 years since I started writing these books, and I've lost so many of these people. Fred Westbrook was the co-author of the aforementioned Encyclopedia of TV Game Shows. And in addition to that, he was an avid collector of game show memorabilia, particularly photos. Photos were his big thing. And he was the agent or the estate executor for every game show host that you would care to name. Fred had some sort of professional relationship with every legendary game show host. So he was the guy that you wanted in your corner, and happily he was in my corner. And so Fred began calling up all of these people that he knew who knew Bill. I wrote a first draft of the manuscript just for Ann's reading, and Ann loved the first draft and said, yes, I want this guy to write my husband's book, and I want to be involved in it. So that was how Ann got involved. And then, bless her, Ann had stayed in touch with everybody who was still alive who had worked on the original Price is Right in the 1950s. So I began talking to these stagehands and the technical crew who had worked on the original Price is Right way back when. And just all of them, it was like they had been waiting their entire lives for somebody to ask them about Bill Cullen, because stories would just pour out of them about their experience working with Bill. And it was nice to know that this guy was a man greatly beloved. He was the person that you thought he was on TV. Just this sincere, likable, humorous, cheerful gentleman who had a long, wonderful career in TV game shows. And there's not much of a story there because there's not much in the way of scandal. There's not much in the way of heartbreak. But that's what drew me to the story, is just the idea that, you can work in show business. Again, a field like I said, where there's a lot of ugly stuff to be said, and a lot of times rightfully ugly stuff needs to be said. But just the idea that somebody like that could enter show business and make a career of it and make a long, successful career of it and just be that good, wonderful person all the way through. There was something that jumped out to me about that, so I was happy to write that book.
We're talking with game show author Adam Nedeff. If you want to purchase his book, Quizmaster, The Life and Time and Fun and Games of Bill Cullen, just go to bearmanormedia.com. That's BearManor Media, bearmanormedia.com to purchase that book. And oftentimes when you publish a book, you find out some fun factoids after the book's been published you didn't know beforehand. And that happened with his bio on Bill Cullen. And next time, Adam shares some of those stories.